But as we noted, we are all locked in on what is going on in Washington, D.C. as President Trump and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He, as you can see there on your screen, are just moments away from signing the Phase 1 trade deal at the White House. Take a listen to what the president had to say about the agreement just moments ago.
Together we are righting the wrongs of the past and delivering a future of economic justice and security for American workers, farmers, and families. Our negotiations were tough, honest, open, and respectful.
All right, so let's dig into what to expect moving forward. Joining us now for more insight is Heritage Foundation's Senior Research Fellow, Dean Cheung, who joins us now remotely. And Dean, just want to get your take on what we're seeing out of D.C. today so far. Obviously, President Trump talking up this Phase 1 trade deal. What's your take on the $200 billion number over the next 2 years in terms of Chinese purchases? And who do you think is getting the better deal out of this one?
Well, I think it does remain to be seen, as some of your other analysts have pointed out. These numbers are very optimistic. We're talking about the Chinese buying more agricultural goods, more machinery, probably even more energy than they have in the past. On agriculture, it's actually, I think, quite possible because of problems in the Chinese agricultural system. They've got a pork disease going on. They've got a caterpillar that's eating up Chinese grains and vegetables. In the longer term, the real devil is going to be on the issue of intellectual property. If the Chinese live up to the terms in the document, which is still seen only by a handful, then that will mark a significant change, I think, an improvement in U.S.-China relations and an improvement in the competitiveness of U.S. industry. If the Chinese renege, if the Chinese wind up violating this agreement, I think we're actually going to wind up worse off because you're going to have some really ugly U.S.-China sentiments.
And you got to think about what might happen in terms of the tariffs that were rolled back and postponed in terms of those tariffs that we saw that actually didn't go into effect, that were supposed to go into effect on December 15th to get to Phase 1 trade deal. Although, you know, when we talk about you're right. It's very hard to dig into the specifics about the deal because, as you're seeing here, it hasn't been signed yet. But the president did give some details about what this Phase 1 deal will ultimately include. Just want to play what he says is included. Take a listen.
The agreement we signed today includes groundbreaking provisions in an area of critical importance to the United States, protecting intellectual property. And I will say this deal, again, they thought it was a $50 billion agricultural deal. Now it's much more than $200 billion.
So there you go, Dean. I mean, when we talk about this intellectual property, forced technology transfers, and even the subsidies supplied to Chinese companies was kind of at the forefront of why we're even in this tit-for-tat trade war to begin with. A lot of people weren't expecting that to really get done, so it's interesting to hear him talk about IP theft off of the Phase 1 deal. But again, no details yet to talk about. What do you make of how that sets it up? Because we've heard President Trump talking about getting Phase 2 already negotiated. So I don't know if it would be fair to say that this deal would be a disappointment if we don't get details on those key issues, because a lot of people weren't expecting that to really be broached this early on in the process.
Well, when we consider that USTR Lighthizer consistently was saying two things. One, any agreement has to have the Chinese acknowledge some kind of metric about cutting back on IP theft, and two, them acknowledging specific consequences of failure to do so. I think that if this agreement doesn't include some measures along those lines, it's going to be seen as much more of a cave-in, I suspect. On the other hand, if it does include those measures, the Chinese are going to have a lot less wiggle room to sort of say, well, that really doesn't count towards IP theft, or why are you reimposing sanctions?
Yeah.
So I spoke to Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross about trade negotiations, and he said that the biggest issue was enforcement. It's not getting a deal signed. It's how you're going to make sure that China actually abides by what it promised. So do you think enforcement is possible at this point?
And Sibile, we'll leave that question on the other side here, because the moment has come, the official signing of the Phase 1 trade deal. We're going to go play that live. Take a listen. All right, so there you go. Wanted to play the sweet, sweet sound of pen hitting paper there on a trade deal that we've been talking about for so long. Finally getting phase one signed there. Wanted to have you hear exactly what it sounds like. But Sibile, we'll get back to your question about Wilbur Ross and what you were talking about there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest issue is how are we going to enforce an actual trade deal? The signing was the easy part, but now it's what kind of resources has President Trump put within this phase one trade deal to be able to check China on actually following through on their promises. Now, what President Trump has said is the way he's going to deal with it is to keep tariffs in place. So that is kind of how he's trying to get to phase two of this trade deal. But it'll be interesting to see how quickly it falls apart because China has told us before that they were going to have more agricultural purchases, and we've seen that fall apart. So we'll see if it's actually going to change this time around.
Yeah, and Dean, I mean, we've seen that play out too. Sabile's absolutely right when we look at kind of the claims that the U.S. has made about China reneging on some of these terms getting up until this historic point, as you see there playing out on your screen. But what do you make of the fact that they did have the existing tariffs on roughly $120 billion worth of Chinese goods and canceled the tariffs that were slated to go into effect, but still have some on? So what do you think that threat actually might do for the Chinese?
Well, I think this is sending a very clear signal that there are going to be consequences if you fail to come through. And on the other hand, there will be positive consequences if you do come through. I think it was Ronald Reagan who talked about trust but verify. In the past, we have had various agreements, the Xi-Obama agreement, for example, on cyber economic espionage, where the Chinese said that they would stop doing that, and they didn't. Without tariffs, without any kind of punishment mechanism and a willingness to use them, and that's what the imposition has signaled, the Chinese basically, have reneged in the past without much fear of consequences. Now, that may still be true even now, but if they want these very substantial current tariffs to be rescinded, they're going to have to come through, at least for a while, with a reduction in things like IP theft.
And it's interesting, too, because all this is playing out in an election year. So no doubt the Democrats on their side are throwing shots as well. Former Vice President and 2020 presidential candidate Joe Biden weighed in on the phase one deal, saying, quote, China is the big winner of Trump's phase one trade deal with Beijing. True to form, Trump is getting precious little in return for the significant pain and uncertainty he has imposed on our economy, farmers, and workers. The deal won't actually resolve the real issues at the heart of the dispute, including industrial subsidies, support for state-owned enterprises, cyber theft, and other predatory practices in trade and technology. To be fair, as we've discussed, a lot of people weren't expecting that right away. It might be too early to say that President Trump's not successful in getting those things done. But there is, I think, a lot to talk about in terms of the amount of money that is now being redirected in terms of subsidies to our farmers that have been harmed here in the U.S. And a lot of people have made that the size of that program, the Farm Rescue Program, is already about 2 times as large as the auto bailout that we saw back in the financial crisis. So it is kind of distorting this trade war. In your mind, though, how fair are Biden's critiques so far?
Well, on the one hand, absolutely. Tariffs are ultimately paid for not by the Chinese, but by the American people. But the flip side to that is, Vice President Biden, as his title implies, was vice president for 8 years. What exactly changed during those 8 years when he was in office with regards to Chinese subsidies, with regards to IP theft, with regards to a host of these sorts of issues? These didn't arise on January 20th, 2017, and it's not as though, the previous administration, war administrations before his, had been markedly successful either.
Yeah, very fair point.
Dean, one thing I found striking as I was watching President Trump talk is that he actually said that American companies have been weak and seem to put the pressure on them or the blame on them for what's happened in terms of intellectual property theft. What do you think of that assessment?
There is absolutely some truth to that. Look, in 1990 or 1995, a company could be going to China and not be aware of the kind of IP theft environment that they were walking into. But in 2015, much less 2020, a company that is going over to China, that is setting up R&D campuses, much less manufacturing facilities, that is entering joint ventures, they don't have an excuse of saying, well, I had no idea. So at some level, they are choosing to walk into the lion's den. That's certainly not justifying Chinese IP theft. But to what extent are American companies playing heads-up ball? That's a good question.
Yeah, and how much is really at stake here, too? I mean, we've talked about the consequences of this distortion and the U.S. consumer, as you're saying, that will be paying for a lot of these tariffs in terms of price increases and things like that. And really how it's helping tech companies that are trying to secure their technology in China, and whether or not that might play out as a positive or a negative for President Trump in 2020. But when you look at the economic impacts of that we're just discussing, what do you make of the way that might impact his reelection chances when you think about how distorting it might become? Of course, he did fear what those 15% tariffs hitting consumer goods around the holiday season might do for the U.S. consumer trying to buy Christmas gifts and holiday gifts. I mean, there was a sense of fear, I guess you could say, in terms of the economic impact here hitting the main consumer. What are your thoughts on how it might shift reelection chances?
Well, I think this agreement actually creates an interesting conundrum for the Democrats, because if the Chinese do renege and the administration reimposes tariffs, he can at that point say, I tried, and I am now standing up for the American business, American IP, American intellectual property, American farmers. It's the Chinese who have reneged. It allows him to shift the focus, if he has to reimpose tariffs, directly onto a Chinese responsibility. On the other hand, if the Chinese do actually come through, then he gets to cover himself with the, look at what I made the Chinese do. I have done this. No previous president has. Now, obviously, the Democrats will spin this in reverse, saying, look, you didn't have to have a trade war. Again, part of the question there is going to be, it's not as though any of the Democratic candidates, as far as I can tell, are standing up for free trade either.
Yep. That's very true, and we've heard a lot of the Democratic candidates on the debate stage, and we're going to talk about this later, not really differentiating too much from what President Trump has done so far to get us here. But Dean Cheung, we're only at Phase 1. We'll have a lot more to talk about, so we'll have to have you back on. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts on Phase 1 with us today.